Dori Tunstall was the Dean of OCAD University and the first Black Dean of a design school anywhere. Last year, she published her book, Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook, and since leaving OCADU, she has continued to advocate for a culturally just world based on respecting vulnerable and marginalized communities. At the center of Dori's approach and tireless efforts is the practice of liberatory joy for bodies and communities. Challenging white privilege and white power structures with knowledge, experience, and love, she has created in partnership with Cal Arts Extended Studies 3 courses to empower leaders and organizations across industries to effectively work towards decolonization and a more just society. When it comes to decolonization, Dori reminds us that if it doesn't hurt, then you're not doing it right.
We all have a stake in liberation. It's not the technology that's the problem. I'm trained as an anthropologist, so we're talking millions of years.
Thanks to you and to your book, honestly, and to your talks, this is the journey that I've started.
Wouldn't it be amazing to use artificial intelligence to accelerate those good values? All those people who are saying we don't need diversity are harming their bottom line. I'm like the Jean-Luc Picard school of leadership because, people should watch the show.
Hi, my name is Eric Vautrin, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to my YouTube channel and podcasts. Here, my mission is simple: to have thought-provoking conversations with remarkable guests. Together, we'll challenge assumptions, broaden our perspective, and ultimately, my hope is that we will all be called to think with more openness, compassion, and clarity. Your support means the world to me, so please do click on that subscribe button. That way, you'll help me bring even more fantastic guests to my show. I hope you enjoy my next guest. All right. Dori Tunstall, welcome to Think with Eric Vautrin. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, former Dean of OCAD University in Ontario and first Black Dean of a Faculty of Design anywhere, author of Decolonizing Design, African American woman, designer, engaged member of society, driver of change, and much, much more. Obviously, none of these labels do justice to who you are, to your journey, and we all have so many facets and identities within ourselves. So, therefore, I'd like to start by asking you, what would you like my listeners and viewers to know about you and your journey as we start our conversation?
So I guess what's important to know about me is not so much the sense of all my accomplishments. I think people have been focusing on that. I think especially this last year or so. Actually, someone did an introduction for me and said the most remarkable thing about me was my laugh.
Oh,
And I've known this person like many, many, many years, and it really thrilled me because what I connected to the way she was describing me and our evolution of our relationship together was that it is the one thing that conveys almost instantaneously like how joyful I am as a person and free, right? In the book, I talk about liberatory joy, and it was the one thing that someone has said of me about me that was just like, oh yeah, that's like the essence of who I am, right? And it comes through very immediately through my laugh. So that's
wow.
something I want people to know about me.
Thanks for sharing. You do have a very beautiful and contagious laugh, and I'm glad that everyone is going to get to hear it through this episode. And I think that leads me to not the first question that I had in mind, but I think a very important question is, do you have to, or how useful is it to have this inner joy and laughter in the work that you are doing in trying to help us in organizations, in academia, and in society to try to decolonize?
Yeah, because the desire for social justice, the desire for economic justice, cultural justice, all of that stems from a deep, 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 deep desire for yourself to be able to express joy freely and openly, and for others to be able to respond and reciprocate that. Like that is the essence I find of most um, justice movements. And so, and again, there's different ways in which people approach it. Some people approach it from a sense of anger. And as my therapist told me, anger is very useful because it cuts through. But I tend to approach it from a sense of joy and what conditions can I create that allow me to be joyful, and then connect to others in a joyful way. And then hopefully through that connection, be able to transmit some of that joy, that they feel it too. And then will want to create conditions to continue to feel that, right? To continue to feel that joy with one another.
I can imagine, and I work a lot on hypotheses, right? So I can imagine a hypothetical that being, as everyone can see, right, a middle-aged white man who myself has benefited from structures of powers that I'm not even aware of, or at least I wasn't. And reading your book and listening to your talks has helped me greatly on that. But I could hypothesize that coming to do the work that you do with this sense of joy and openness and wanting everyone to have that possibility and place to feel it and express it may allow you to encounter less initial defense mechanisms, especially in a population like myself. Would that be somewhat accurate as a hypothesis?
It's not even a hypothesis. It's actually quite accurate. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Scotland, in Dundee, Scotland, and I was doing a presentation as part of the Council for Higher Education in Art and Design.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to do my talk, and I do a land acknowledgement for every place that I'm visiting, which becomes quite fascinating, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I talked about in Scotland how, first of all, recognizing the history of Scotland being colonized by the English, right? And then within that, also the complications of the fact that they were deeply embedded in the Great British colonial project. And so how that creates, again, tensions in between that. And then, but also again, how, let's say, Dundee, Scotland, all these places have become very diverse places where many people around the world are building their homes and building a good life. And that's how I started the talk. And then I go through all the thing. And everyone afterwards came up to me and they said how shook they were, because it hadn't occurred to them to really think about why their parents, I guess because of grandparents, maybe great grandparents, or for some of them maybe their parents had gotten onto boats to leave Scotland, Ireland, wherever, come to Canada, the United States, Australia, all these places, um, wreak havoc in these places. And they were actually, like many of them, the first generation to come back, right? To come back home to Scotland, Ireland, etc. And so it opened up some really deep conversations and deep reflections about our shared histories, the stacking and layering of oppressions that go on, and how we all have a stake in liberation, right? We all have a stake in decolonizing, understanding our histories, understanding our traditions of making, um, embracing those in all of their complexity, and then working with the next generation to figure out what those things become, right? And so they were surprised by how generous, I think that's the word they kept using, how generous the conversation was. um but for me, it's a thing where, like I said, I'm interested in the liberation of everyone. And if, I say one of the key takeaways is that, those of European heritage have to address their own intergenerational trauma,
Mm.
because part of the brutalities, right, that were inflicted and the continued brutalities, right, against different people comes from deep, deep, deep trauma and pain that just hasn't been dealt with, right? So by dealing with it, you take that first step of decolonization to understand um, how you've been hurt, how your family have been hurt, and then how you begin to heal that hurt so that you are open to be connected with others in a respectful way.
And I thank you for those words, not only here, but also in your book. In your book, I think you said at the beginning, I don't have the exact quote, but like you're going to be, you're not going to mince your words, right? You have things that you want to say, but to be open for it and just to listen and to take things in and to reflect. And you talk about, the trauma of the conflicts within Europe, which were then exported. Like that was in people. And basically, when they went somewhere else, and we can experience this in our day to day when we take in emotions, we facilitate workshops, we work with organizations, whatever it may be in society. We take in a lot of things from other people. And sometimes we, unfortunately, unintentionally, we release it within our family or our friends, right? And you mentioned this in the book that we as colonizers or former colonizers have that, or within our heritage, have that healing work to do so that we can free ourselves of that pain and be then in a different place to work towards social justice. And thanks to your book, I went into my own family history. I knew a little bit about it, but then I said, okay, let me do the work on my side.
Oh, thank you for doing that. That makes me so happy.
It's and I want to share a little bit with you because I find it interesting because you just mentioned the Scottish and Irish. And so I was born just outside of Jochagay, what I knew as Montreal. And I know my pronunciation is not great, but it's something that I want to practice. And I grew up on the south shore of the island in a small suburb called Brossard. And this city and this whole area obviously is located on unceded lands. Yeah? The Kaniokkehaga, the Mohawk Nation, is recognized as custodian of the lands and waters on which I grew up. And from your book, I also realize and understand the importance of recognizing the custodians and the original Aboriginals who lived on the land that my forefathers ended up colonizing. My own heritage is part settler colonial, so with my French surname. The first Vautrin is believed to have settled in Quebec around 1750, 1760. There were two brothers in the French. They were French soldiers. And after the French lost to the British allowed the French soldiers who wanted to return home to do so freely, and those who wanted to settle. And one of the two brothers settled. Then I have a part, I would say, settler immigrant heritage, which is Scottish Irish. Yeah. So depending on the year and the period. So I'm like 30% Scottish Irish, which I think for Canadians and Northeastern Americans is probably very common as well. And then from my mother's side, where it's actually Ukrainian Russian immigrants from the 1900s.
Okay. So like I think you hit all the touch points in terms of the immigration waves.
And yes, and above that, according to my DNA test, I do have some markers of First Nation heritage, but you never know for sure. Interestingly, is that there's this American woman about 15 years ago who did the genealogy of our Vautrin family, and she found evidence, but it's not confirmed, of this First Nation heritage.
Okay.
Who knows, right? So it was something that I'm trying to find out more about, but it's very possible as a Canadian that at some point, right, I would have that heritage as well. More recently, my half-great uncle, Irénée Vautrin, was actually a member of cabinet in Quebec from 1930 to 1935. And from 1934 until he was beaten in the election in 1935, he was Minister of Colonization.
Wow.
So he was my grandfather's half brother. Obviously, I didn't know him, but I seem to have, everything, and I'm sure a lot of trauma which has been,
Mhm.
passed down within generations. And thanks to you and to your book, honestly, and to your talks, this is the journey that I've started, which led me to read True Reconciliation
Mhm.
by Jody uh, Jody Rainbow. I'm going to forget her second last name.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I can remember. And it's an important journey as a Canadian to do. But I think living in Europe now for more than 13 years, it's also a very important journey for Europeans to do. Even though their families may have stayed here,
Mhm.
a lot of their relatives may have gone away, as you spoke about in Scotland and Ireland, and some generations may come back. But we are all interconnected in that way, and I think they also have their work to do, and it's not just about those who live on the land in North America or in
Mhm.
other countries.
Well, and that's
Um,
the thing I find fascinating about the decolonization journey within Europe, because a lot of it is about understanding and taking ownership of how, in many ways, the wealth of Europe was built through colonization, right? So, again, being in Dundee, talking about, so their three products was jute, jam, and journalism. Which I got the greatest sweater, Shetland sweater, with those motifs. But again, you can't talk about jute, right, without talking about colonization. And there's actually this wonderful historian who's doing a lot of work to trace the wealth of like Scottish cities directly to the transatlantic slave trade, directly to, again, like the money that was sent back, right, from the American cousins or whatever, back to Europe, up until really like World War II, when the government decided it's going to support all people with, Social Security and all those sort of things, right? But before that, it was the money sent back home, right? That was keeping communities afloat, right?
and I mean, to a certain extent, we still see that organizations, corporations look for cheap labor, yeah,
Hmm.
in the name
Hmm.
of keeping costs low, shareholders, whatever it may be. But it seems to be a pattern which is, in that sense, similar, right? And on the one hand, you have people who need work, they need money, and they will migrate or they will do the jobs that they can do in order to do their best to support their families. But we're not paying them fair wages for what they're doing, which in a way is a similar pattern, right? Look
Hmm.
for the
Hmm.
opportunities that you can exploit, and opportunities are never just um, things like land or water, which we also know the consequences of doing that. But
Right.
there's always people around those
Mhm.
things that we're trying to extract and produce, and we're looking for the cheapest means to do it, be it in IT, be it in the extraction of minerals for the modern
Smartphone.
technology, yeah, smartphone, right?
Yeah.
And you talk
Smart
also
car.
in your book about the modernist project, right? You come
Yeah.
from a design background, right? So if I understand correctly, so I mean it's product design, space design, it's design in general, design principles, and
Correct.
understanding the world, the connection, the relationship between people, their environment, their tools, and yeah, from a visual, functional, and I imagine many more perspectives. And you talk about the modernist project as being something European, which I'm educating myself through, right, reading and
Mhm.
listening to you, and how technology is an unequal frame to view the world through,
Yeah.
because not everyone benefits from it in the way that we in Europe or in North America do. Yet I was honestly blind to that idea and to that perspective of who are the people who are producing it, who can afford it, who really can benefit from it. Um, yeah, and I definitely like to hear you share a little bit more
Yeah.
about that, because we seem to be a technology focused world and media and society at the moment, and we shouldn't leave out that part when we discuss it.
Well, I mean, I think the point that I'm trying to make is that it's not the technology that's the problem. It's the underlying consciousness or intentions. Like as creatures, not even just human creatures, as creatures, we use tools to address any weaknesses that we find in how we relate to our environment and how we survive. Like, you know, hundreds of, again, I'm trained as an anthropologist. So, like, we're talking millions of years of using tools. So, it's not the tool, the technology is not the problem. It's what we've decided is the best use of that technology. So, in the modernist design project, which to sort of just to cover the definitions, is like I talk about as the story that we tell in Europe, that design is something that happened in Europe in the 1800s, and through design, you would create, wealth for the masses, and by letting go of our national ethnic markers, we can all join universal humankind. So that's the mythology. So when people are like gravitating towards, let's say, modern design, those are the things actually they're gravitating to. And again, as ideas, oh my gosh, like making the lives of people better through technology, that's a good idea, right? The problem with that was that in formulating everybody, it was a very, very narrow definition of everybody, right? And by that sort of focus on sort of white, male, Christian, um, land owning or wealth owning, mercantile owning, right? Class, right? That was who it's defined for. Shifted a little bit with the Bauhaus in the sense of like they were kind of also focused on a kind of working class ethos, right, as part of it. But again, that it was the limitation of imagining who everyone could be and how you design those technologies so it truly benefited everyone. And then by benefiting everyone, again, then you extrapolate. That means it can't harm other people who have to do the labor for it, right? It can't harm the environment by poisoning it and destroying it and not allowing it all the other creatures who live in that environment to live and regenerate and all these things. So the, the problem is our limitation in terms of what technology is for. And again, I talk just a little bit about, artificial intelligence, which just makes things more efficient. Like the whole driver is efficiency. How fast can we have this thing computated so that we can make a decision or do this? Or how fast can we generate uh, a statement or a picture without having someone actually do it, right? Like, so, so the problem with the efficiency of like artificial intelligence is that we're putting that efficiency to all of the wrong things, right? So painting doesn't need to be more efficient. Like there's like again, like there's unless you're just wanting to produce more, which again in an art market it really is better for you not to have a lot. Right, like the price is determined by the rarity of the object that is being created. So the ideal of being able to create really quickly multiples, again, lowers the price point so that more people can afford it. But it doesn't, again, it doesn't increase the value, right, of the making by making it more efficient, right? So that to me says like, okay, so using artificial intelligence and the concept of sort of art making, to me, like that's operating against the value proposition of art making. So that's not an area that you would put it in. Now, using artificial intelligence to make now, let's say the parts of like generative artificial intelligence that I think is very useful actually is the thing of like when you talk about in design. And I think about this from industrial design and the poor students that I have, like not so much this generation. So let's say some of my colleagues and before who had to do by hand thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of drawings,
Yeah.
which again is great. It builds that skill, but it also leads to carpal tunnel and all these other issues that negatively affect the health, right? So, okay, using generative AI to say, I have this idea and I need to see multiples of it in order to be able to really figure out, is this the thing that I want to do, or is this the shape that creates the greatest harmony? Again, using AI to help facilitate as a tool that process. Again, brilliant, but it's still used by someone who is skilled. It's just helping them move more efficiently through a process, which again could lead to other harms if they continue to do it the traditional way, right? So there is the use, like there's an appropriate use of it. Other uses that are, being used for warfare, uh, being used again to feed in pornographic systems in one way or another, being used to again make decisions that are based on data that is biased against certain classes, certain genders, certain ages, certain races, all these sort of things, because again, AI, it's all based on the quality of the information that it is quickly scanning to develop a pattern understanding of, right? So all of these things again is about the technology in and of itself is agnostic, neutral, maybe
Yeah.
in one way to say it. It's the intentionalities that we still as humans are deciding to put it into that again just follows along the ways in which we are again continue to build systems of hierarchy, right? Continue to build systems of exclusion, continue to build systems of oppression and exploitation. And so the work that has to be done is to change our intentionality around
Mhm.
what we create in the world. And then wouldn't it be amazing to use artificial intelligence to accelerate those good values, those just values, those inclusive values? Because that's what technology does. It just makes it more efficient for things to move throughout the world, right?
Yeah. What came to mind as you were sharing all of that is efficiency for what, for whom, in that
Mm-hmm.
sense, right? Because you can get more efficient at producing your smartphone and your laptop, but if the people who, there's still people involved, are actually helping to produce them, can't afford them themselves, like, so the efficiency then is just for a very small group of people. um, a shift towards an efficiency which benefits, as you said, it's not the technology in and of itself that has a positive or a negative, let's say, trajectory. It's how the intentionality of the people who are designing it, who are thinking about selling it, marketing it, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
um, and actually, after reading your book, I reflected on my experience in large organizations, and I wanted to ask you about this because I'm not sure if it's colonization, centralization, a little bit of both, or neither. But one thing that I noticed is that we tend to run projects. I've worked for large multinationals, and we tend to run projects where we're a small group of individuals who are supposedly very smart and knowing about these topics. We will approach the team, the department, whatever it may be, in which we believe change needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
We will then go collect all kinds of data from them on what it is that they're doing, how they're doing it. And we give nothing in return normally for what we're taking. We go away as very smart people and design something for them. In the best of situations, they're involved, but often they're not. We may then hire also an external consulting company to work with us on the design. And then we go in, we implement it, very often agnostic of the context in which they're in. We're done. Good luck. And we move on to the next department or the next team.
Mm-hmm.
in the name of efficiency, once again, efficiency for whom and at what cost. And I believe you've moved also from academia now into full time, right, into working with companies and large multinationals. Would you understand this as a continuation of the ideas which underpin colonialism? Is it just efficiency and a good way of doing things? Is it centralization? Or is it a mix of all of that together?
I say it's a mix because again, my first professional jobs was in high tech consulting. So my first jobs were like eLab Sapient. I was explaining this actually to someone earlier last week, where it's like, yeah, we were the like generation of people that threw together to figure out what this newfangled internet thing was going to do, right? And so, and people forget it's like, yeah, some people actually had to. Develop the scenarios and possibilities and do the research to figure out what those things were, not to just disrupt people's lives, but actually to fit in. So, my first professional job was as an anthropologist, trying to understand the role of technology and how people work and how they communicate and how they shop and how they communicate with one another, right? Um, so this is the part where I talk about in the book, like, so my attitude towards technology is probably more optimistic than most, because I know what it means to, again, I say we were the company that your companies would hire to go in and understand, what is this technology going to mean to people? What is it going to mean to the way in which they work? And there are places where that it's really hard, right?
Mm-hmm.
For let's say, I worked a lot with the financial services, because I love the abstract but super symbolic quality of money. So I always chose to do like the insurance companies or the banks or whatever, because I was just fascinated by what we all do with and for money, right? Um, and there are real, like to ride around with an insurance person who's sitting around in their car trying to gather the information to prepare um, on for a client to sell them insurance. Again, they're not approaching it, like from the sense of like, oh, I'm just trying to get over on them, right? They're approaching it from the sense of like, and they'll tell you their stories of like, my father passed away when we were 7. They didn't have any insurance. This led my mom going into debt, and made our lives really, really difficult. So I sell insurance because I want to make sure that no family is unprepared, right? Like that's the stories they tell. So to use technology to make it easier for them to gather that information that they need to gather, or to figure out what are the right products, right, that suit this particular family and their need and their price point and their experience of things, like, there, to me, like that is important work. And the places where we fall off, right, is when we don't do that work. When we go and we say we want to be disruptive and we don't care about what the user needs, because the user doesn't really matter, because they don't really know what they need or they don't know what they want, which is some attitudes of like large companies, right? Or again, they're limited in their imagination of like who their user is, because let's say in this network of relationships, right, let's say like again, the young boy who is having to mine the cobalt to go into your smartphone, that is your user as well, right? So again, I always say it's the limitation of that, and I wouldn't even say human centered, right? Like it's that limitation of understanding that we are all interconnected, that what we do here, the decision that's made in a boardroom here, actually has direct impact on so many people's lives that you can't imagine. And it means that all of the people who are making decisions all the way up that chain to the CEO, right, have to have a broader understanding of what the impact of those decisions are going to be. Like the one thing that always found frustrating about, again, working in the high tech and especially the financial services, is that the the level of decision making that gets filtered to a CEO is like, mostly is like, is something going up or is something going down?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So all of the nuances that are behind that are actually stripped away by all the different people, so that, like the executive summary, which we often had to write, was like, oh, if you do this, it'll go up. And if you do this, this will go down. And that's all they needed to know in order to be able to make the decision. And part of the work we were trying to do, again, from this like human centered, again, all living system centered design, is say, hey, when you're making that decision, these are actually all the things that are going up and down simultaneously. Can we develop a strategy where, again, all of the things besides profit, right, is going up in terms of being more sustainable, more just, whatever, and then all of the bad things about exploitation and extraction are going down, right? And getting to be able to have those conversations, right? um, that's the kind of work that I am trying to do and wanting to do more of. Because again, it's a thing where it's the limitation of our imagination that causes us to exclude the perspectives of those who could provide useful indicators for what is the optimum decision that benefits everyone and everything.
Yeah, the job of a CEO is definitely not an easy one.
No.
To your point, and having been there as well, information is pre-chewed, pre-analyzed. In effect, often, decisions have already tried to be made before it's presented to the CEO, to him or her.
Mhm.
Right, so that some things are left out or some things are rounded in a certain way and adjusted. Yeah, and we always present three options, and we all know that we want the person to move either towards these two but definitely not that one. So
Yeah.
the pro list of the two first ones are huge, right, and the cons are small. And they, I mean, CEOs, yeah, they're obviously educated, smart people who have gotten there for a reason, but they also, just like all of us, right? We have biases, heuristics, all these mechanisms
Mhm,
that our
mhm,
brains are
mhm,
just
mhm.
trying to make our energy consumption lesser in order to operate on a day-to-day basis. Um, and so it makes it very difficult for them if they don't have maybe a certain framework or an approach which allows them to say, okay, hold on, that's great. But what would it mean for this? What would it mean for that? How do I ensure that I'm not, I think you probably have heard of pattern entrainment, so expert
Mhm,
bias, right?
mhm, mhm, mhm.
How do I make sure I'm not baking bread every time because I'm a baker and that's my tendency?
Right.
And I'm wondering if having a diverse board, right? And it's something that you also talk about in your book, diversity
Mhm,
versus having a token person,
mhm,
yeah, of a
mhm,
certain
mhm, mhm,
ethnicity or
mhm.
religion or minority status. But I wonder if having diversity in the board can facilitate that kind of thinking, and maybe it's a little bit slowing down compared to what they're used to because they have to consider three, four, five different opinions or impacts before they make their decision. But in the end, it'll have more benefit for not only their shareholders, yeah, and profit, but also their communities, their employees, and the environment, and so on. Have you seen differences when you approach diverse boards versus a lot of boards that just look like many of me's?
Yeah, and I've had the luxury of being on so many different boards at so many different stages of my life. I'm currently a chair of one board where we're actually going through and diversifying the board and on many different dimensions, right? I just on another board that I'm on, they actually just finished the process, in terms of, again, and so yes, the solution to that is having a critical mass of diverse perspectives that are there who can help you as a leader see what is the different impacts this decision can make, right? And this is where I'm like the Jean-Luc Picard school of leadership, because I mean, people should watch the show, right? Because he models that very well. Like you know, you have a sense of different perspectives of different people in the
Hmm.
in both their function, but also in terms of like what their lived experiences are and what that brings, and you know, like who's going to be the one who's like, let's always go to war, and who's going to be the one like, oh no, let's not do this, and who's going to be the one who's like, this is the technical challenge that we have to face, and this is the person like, well, this is the history of our interactions with these people and whatever. So as a leader, I felt that why Jean-Luc Picard and others who have that kind of leadership style are effective leaders is that they listen to the diversity of the perspectives and they try to choose an optimum solution that has taken into account the impacts of that decision on these various groups, right, that are represented. And so, like I said, on the board that we're reshaping, we're looking for regional diversity because this is in Canada. So we're trying to get representation around the different province. And we're learning already some huge differences because the original board was very Toronto centered, right? And we were talking about, and it's like a simple conversation. We were like, okay, we need to hire an executive director. What should be the salary, right? And like, so all the Torontonians are saying, oh, well, you're not going to get anyone good for like $100,000 for less than $100,000 per year. And then all of those who are like in like the coast or the central places, besides Vancouver, are all like, that
100K.
that's like double this average salary for anyone who is
Hmm.
in this particular region in this particular sector. So all of a sudden we're having this conversation of like, well, what is fair? What is equitable? If we put it to 100K, like, yes, that's going to be sort of really, really great. But it's, does it have impact, right, on what are the salaries in all these other regions if we choose to have someone who's out of the major metropolitan areas, right? But if we want someone for the major metropolitan areas, we have to pay them a livable wage. So all of a sudden, this is a conversation because we decided regional diversity was important. Again, we talk about identities of structural inclusion. So they've been generally excluded, but we want to make sure that they're having it. And then because it's in the art board, it's having different perspectives on the arts, right? So from writers to gallerists to whatever. So again, the idea of reframing this board is to make sure, like for every sector, we have people who can help us identify what is going to be the impact of that decision on that sector, on that region, what lived experiences it might shape or not shape, so that we come up with an optimum decision that supports as much as possible all of those variances. Or if it's not, if it's going to be detrimental to a specific group, then we plan what is our remedial action or get ahead of it to have the conversations to say, this is what this impact is going to be. But to address that, to mitigate that impact, we are going to need to do X, Y, and Z. Is that okay with you? Can you buy into that decision in doing that? So yes,
More diverse
diversity
board.
of perspectives
Yes.
the way to go. And and it's and again, like there's the metrics that are behind that. More diverse boards means more profitability, means actually being able to more strategic prowess, one to speak, because you're able to better identify what external influences might actually shape the way in which a decision goes, better prediction, right, of like future possibilities. So all of those things are actually documented in one way or another. Um, I guess my thing is, especially being now in the United States, where there is a great effort to dismantle the real gains, positive gains of diversity, equity, inclusion, um, is that um, again, this is the thing where the addiction to white supremacy does significant harm because all those people who are saying we don't need diversity are harming their bottom line. They're harming their industries. where just from population shifts in wealth, shifts in education, shifts in everything, you're not going to be able to survive very long as an industry that only caters to, again, white Christian males who have property and or wealth in one form or another.
Two things come to mind that are very different. I think the first one is my feeling is that, and it's my experience recently, slowing down a little bit at the board level, at the organizational level, allows us to go faster in the end.
Exactly.
Because we go fast at the beginning, we tend to efficiency fast, we plan fast, we make decisions fast, and in reality, in no way fits into the things that we thought were going to happen. We put on paper. There's all these unforeseen impacts, but the timeline is already too short, and we're not going to reconsider, extending it until the last minute, and then we have to escalate and then go back to the board. And it feels like slowing down a little bit. I'm not saying a standstill, and you do write in your book that you're a doer, so you yourself,
I know, like I was gonna say, I struggle with this one all the time. But I'm learning. So
But when we a
you're right.
little bit, and we slow down and we take those diverse perspectives and we look, and I'm just again, the 7 generation principle, just the idea of looking a few steps ahead, but from those many different perspectives to make a more informed, more just, and more balanced approach, plan, product, or the value that we're going to bring to our customer, tends to work better. But we seem to be so afraid of this idea of slowing down just even a little bit.
Well, and this is the thing where, like we're forgetting the lessons of the pandemic. So during the pandemic, again, especially in Canada, where we had like the longest border closing than any other place in the world. And I remember, again, as dean, telling especially the chairs, but like the entire faculty, so saying, okay, at this point we only need to focus on those things that are actually survival mode, right? Because right now we're all in crises. So focus in on, and again, as an educators, our primary things is just like the still providing within this context with lots of generosity and grace, the quality of the education we're providing to our students who are all in stress and are distressed, right? So we are not well, and so we need to slow things down. And I got like institutional pushback against that, but it was a thing where it was so important. Again, when you're a leader and you're meeting with your leadership teams, and you can see and hear their stress, you can see and hear their exhaustion. Then if you care, like I said, as the things that we do, like unless you're a doctor, where you are really dealing with life and death situations, then everything can be postponed. Everything, if you're in relationship with a client, right, not just transactional, but in relationship to a client, then again, the earlier you can say, you know what, this pace seems to be a little bit too fast, let us renegotiate this because I'm burning out my team. We see on the horizon more mistakes being made, or you haven't done the work internally to get everyone on board to move faster, so let's just slow this down a little bit so that we can have a better sense of, so that people are clear what their roles are in making these things happen and feel confident in their ability to go forward without being micromanaged in doing that. So let's slow things down and focus on the things that really truly matter. Um, and that was a really important lesson, both in terms of like that cognitive process of saying what really matters, what is core here, and what are things that we'd like to do or we want to do because it delivers all this extra value, but it's not core to who we are and what we need to do. And especially since we're surviving in just functional mode, like we're just trying to get up in the morning and turn on the Zoom, let's slow things down. And coming out of that form like the pandemic and the pandemic response, I still try to keep things like take the learnings of what matter to help in the prioritization of where people put their energy. Because again, coming into this mode of the pandemic, we still are in a pandemic, but this mode of it, people are like, okay, let's get back to normal. Let's go back to hyper efficiency. Let's go back to this. And part of the thing I was trying to push in my last sort of bits as a leader at OCAD University was that okay, we learned a bit about slowness. We learned a bit about giving people like what is a reasonable pace. Yes, we know that there's deadlines. Yes, we know that there's things. And most of that is driven by, one would say, management that has not provided people with the staffing that they need to be able to do the tasks as required. And rather than say, okay, we're going to do different tasks or we're not going to do this task at all, they're just piling it on. And so then someone's super frazzled and they're like, okay, you have to deliver this by Tuesday because I have to do this thing on Wednesday. And all of a sudden, we've set up this false urgency, which is real for them, right? But it's driving decisions that actually is only creating more stress and more urgency for everyone, which doesn't need to be there. Um, so the other part of that is you again as a manager is making sure that you have the appropriate allocation of staffing for the workload that you're asking to be done. And we know from the processes of layoffs and all these things that like they have a sense of what the optimum mode might be. Um, and sometimes they overfill it because they get optimistic, or sometimes they cut it because what we're finding now is that they're taking, instead of paying people on the ground, they're increasing their shareholder value, right? By reappropriating money that should be paid in salaries to the work that is being done, that is the true core of the work, to the management of the work, right? Which I would say has less value.
I would, having been and being a manager myself, I can still agree to that without shame. I mean, in the end, as managers, hopefully we're there to facilitate the removal of obstacles and barriers and actually to bring the knowledge of those who are closest to the customer doing the work back into the organization. They don't need us to do their jobs in that sense. They really don't. And if we're just there to do calculations on KPIs and dashboards and productivity scores and financial reports, well, I mean, first of all, we'll soon be replaced by AI for a lot
Yeah,
of that,
yeah.
which may not be a bad thing. Not that I want to make myself redundant, but if the work doesn't add value to the customer,
Well, everyone
and
was really shocked that as a dean, I still taught.
ah,
And it was a
yeah,
thing where and the way I interpreted that is that, well, part of the job description, right, is that you have an understanding of the student experience. So for me, the best way to do that is to teach a class. So I taught one class per semester. During the pandemic, I taught two classes per semester. And then the last couple of years, I didn't teach because it was a thing. I was still helping. There was the workload in terms of giving people back on track at the slower pace that I was trying to advocate for, meant that I wasn't able to teach. But it was a thing where, again, staying connected to the core of what the institution was doing was really important to, well, first of all, just to build a sense of understanding and empathy. Because again, and I remember like the IT used to do on Friday mornings, they would do their maintenance. And I
mhm.
had actually taught a class on Friday mornings at 8:30 a.m. And again, was able to experience how, like, yes, that's, the majority of classes are not Friday at 8:30 a.m. But when your technology is not working because it's undergoing a maintenance mode, then that just makes it more difficult for the person, the teacher, who has like the worst time slot ever. So I was like, well, okay, since I'm the teacher who's experiencing this, can we possibly find another time in which IT can do their maintenance? Because it really creates a difficult experience for the faculty. It's a difficult experience for the students who are, again, unlucky to have this time slot. And again, I understand the efficiency of doing so, but it means, again, doing harm to those who are in the situation, like has the worst luck of anyone in terms of their time slot. Um, and because I was the dean and I could articulate that experience, then it changed, right? Like that, they changed their maintenance schedule so it wasn't affecting that poor class. But I wouldn't have known that. And let's say a professor who was teaching an 8:30 or a student who is going to 8:30, they may complain about it, but not complain about it in a way that, let's say, or not even complain about it because they're just like, this is just the luck of the draw that I have, right? So I always say, as a leader and a manager, the thing I make it easier in terms of decision making is I figure out, like, how is this going to affect the most vulnerable person in this network, right? Um, and so teaching for me was one of the ways that sometimes you have to remember you're the most vulnerable person in the network, but generally it's like, it's some, unlucky students or a group of, most of the time, part-time faculty who are stuck at 8:30 a.m. on Friday might be the most vulnerable in this situation. So being able to connect or tap into that in a direct way is a really important aspect of maintaining the sense of the core of what it is that you're doing, why you're there, right? But also being able to make decisions that, again, take into account what are the ways in which you need to remove situations that cause greater vulnerability for those vulnerable people, right?
And to what you were saying earlier about what's happening in the US and partially, or at least an attack on DEI and dismantling of it, I would imagine that will increase the risk that there will not be that representation of people who have done the work themselves, for example, in the past, who are then in leadership and senior leadership positions. So again, you may have, I mean, there are mostly only middle-aged white men on boards let's be clear about that, but it will reduce the chance of the diversity increasing. And that leads me to a question that I want to ask you, which makes me uncomfortable, but I actually think that you're the right person to ask this question to. Is that as a middle-aged white man, there isn't just one, let's say, opinion from the entire African American community. And I think that's fair. Maybe if people don't know that because they tend to hear one louder voice, right? There are differences in opinions around systemic racism, around DEI, around affirmative action. A couple of people that you may know who I listen to sometimes are like Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, the Glenn Lowry Show. They have different guests on with different opinions as well. But as a middle-aged white man, if I look, I want to hear different opinions on these topics because I'm uneducated and not contextualized. I will never experience that to be able to have my own opinion from that direct experience. But then by having all these diverse, let's say, views on it, there could be the tendency for me to find that view from one or two people who actually, then it doesn't require me to do any work that confirms that I'm not doing anything wrong, and that I don't have privilege, and that I'm just a generally nice person, and I'm open to cultures and whatnot. But they might not be wrong either to a certain extent. So how do I, is the work just to actually, is the work to listen, to sit with it, to question, to come back and to do my best? How do I go about listening to these different opinions around diversity, equity, inclusion from the African American community and academics and professionals themselves?
The question I always ask, which you sort of started, is sort of like, okay, Who does this perspective benefit?
Mm-hmm.
Who does this perspective harm? Or again, leads to situations of greater vulnerability? Um, Again, who is sponsoring them? Where's trace the money? Where's the
Mm-hmm.
money coming from?
Oh, you have your famous quote in your book, right?
Yeah, follow the money. Um, all perspectives are not created equal. And this is I think a fallacy that we have, that in many ways has resulted in the dismantling of trust of our, let's say, journalism system, right? Because there's a way in which there was this discourse, right, of all voices are fair and equal, and there isn't equality of voices, and there isn't equality of perspectives. So again, for me, my guiding post is always like, who is expressing the position of the most vulnerable in this situation, right? So like I would say, I listen I listen to a lot of indigenous women.
Mm-hmm.
I listen to the voice of a lot of like Black trans men or women, right? Because those are the ones who tend to be the most vulnerable in the positions, in the social positions that they are in, right? This is why they say always listen to Black women, except a few, because they have decided, like, again, where their alliances lie. And my alliances always ally with the most vulnerable. If their alliances lie with those who already have privilege, or they're trying to protect their privilege, whether this is by gender or it's by class, then those are the things, like, again, they have a perspective and a lived experience and a set of ambitions that I understand, but that's not going to create social, economic, or cultural justice, because the system of social, economic, cultural justice is based on um, shifting the positionality of those who are the most vulnerable to be hurt in any of those systems. Who's the most vulnerable in the economic system? Who is the most vulnerable from a cultural perspective? Who is the most vulnerable from, like a religious perspective or all this perspective? Is figuring out who those are, and then listening to. And sometimes it's hard because they don't have access to the platforms either. So again, it's always being careful about who has access to the platform, um, and really listening very closely to those who are in the position to be most harmed. So in conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, the perspective that should be listened to are those who are showing you what is the harm that is going to be done by some of these changes, which again you alluded to. Now the thing is that, like, as an African American, like, we've seen this before. Like, I've been reading a lot about the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction period in U.S. history, right? And so we know what this looks like. We in a multi-generational perspective, we've experienced this before. um, so it's a thing where, anyone who is not anyone who is not taking into account the addiction to systems of white supremacy in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, in all of these different places. Like, that is the anyone who's not talking about, let's say, the dismantling of some kind of hierarchy, whether that's by class or by gender or whatever, like, if they're not talking about dismantling of hierarchy, and they're just they're making the position of just like, let us join in at a higher rank of the hierarchy, then those are the voices that you should be suspicious, right, of listening to. Because anyone who is committed to social, economic, and cultural justice, what they're asking for is allow difference to flow without a hierarchy. Now, the work, I always say, like the work of decolonization is the work of white folks because they're the ones who have built that system. They are the ones who, again, are addicted to the benefits of white supremacy culture, which again makes life so much easier for them. So much energy to devote to golf and all these other things. But you have to devote your life, you don't have to devote your energy to surviving in the same sort of way, right? So it's a thing, and what knowledge white folks hold is how the systems actually work. Like as a person who is outside of those systems, again, it is only taking me the opportunity to be inside those systems to understand how they work. But a lot of people don't have access to that understanding, and even I am limited in my understanding and access to how things work. So you also have to work like in solidarity and partnership because to dismantle the systems, I would say white folks need to know where it is causing pain and harm for others. But they know the systems well enough to say, that is a specific point in which we need to dismantle this aspect of it. Because that is actually what is causing the barrier. That is actually what is causing the harm. Again, you may not be able to see the harm because the system is designed to make sure you don't. But the system is also designed to make sure that you know exactly how the system works. So working in partnership, solidarity, is how we dismantle the system. And maybe going full circle again, like that's why I approach it with this into like generosity and openness, is that the
Yeah.
only way in which this system change is if we're all working together to change it, right?
I mean, thank you for adding that perspective and dimension to how to interpret and reflect on the things that me as a white person hear from within the African American community. And I think instinctively I know how the system works without even having to think about how it works. But then if we sat down and we exchange, I'd be, oh yeah, well, it works like this. And if you do that, then you sort of, play this game, dance to that tune, then yeah, it just makes things easier to get through these doors and to have these opportunities. And I feel, and there's this great author, Nora Bateson, who's also a film director, and she also leads the International Basin Institute. And she talks about the thoughts that are so deep that we don't even know that there are other thoughts built on top. And those are sort of the dangerous ones. Those are the ones that we need to get to. And I think as myself, as a white person, I know that there are some underneath other thoughts that I'm not aware of. And it's not because I'm intrinsically, a bad person or I don't want to get to them. It's just they're buried so deep. Yeah. And there's so many other thought structures on top that unless I work with other people or do the work myself and get some input from others, yeah, I won't get to those sort of root thoughts and then realize, oh, dear God, yeah, okay, that is, it's there. Even though I didn't know or think it was there, it's there. And I read this great book also from an Australian Aborigine. Tyson is his name. He wrote a book called Sand Talk. And he said something which I had never honestly seen or thought of before. He says, when you see that picture, the evolution of man as a species, he's like, did you ever notice that the last person at the end is probably about 1.80 m tall, European looking? It's not a short Asian, African American woman, man, the summum of evolution, right? Visually speaking, is that. And then you're like, oh, right? Like those cues are there. Those messages are there in design, visually, in the media, in many, many forms, right? So this idea of a collaboration and a partnership, yeah, I do need help. We do need help. And we do also intrinsically know the system that has been built over these past centuries. And we can work with one another to understand how we can change them quicker, more effectively, and which parts we need to, for example, completely tear down. And on the one hand, and I wanted to also talk about Aboriginals in North America. And on the one hand, in organizations, we need to slow down a little bit so that we do better and we're more efficient. And on the other hand, I would say we've been slow enough when it comes to land rights, water rights, self-governance, and all these, fundamental self-determination rights that Aboriginal and Aborigine people intrinsically have as human beings. And there we seem to be very, very slow. And I know you've done and you continue to do work with those communities. How can we, and how can we speed up and actually be more humane and compassionate and move forward, do you think, on those topics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a thing where, well, I would say, like, and again, I live in a bubble, so I admit that, but I have been both amazed and shocked by, particularly in the United States, these efforts to give land back, right? So, like Berkeley, former parking lot, they're now giving back the land, and there's different places where like the land is being given back. There's not enough land, uh, and I would say, in the context of Canada with the Truth and Reconciliation. And the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 2015, I think it was the date. That like when I talk to my First Nations, Métis, Inuit colleagues, they talk about like that there was a change when you have the apology in Australia, which is actually around the same time. Well, it's a little bit earlier, right? But it was when I talked to my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, they say there was a huge difference. Like a lot of that feels hurt by the recent vote no in terms of having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation. But there was a real sense of, and someone said to me, is like, I see a better future for my children. That, so it's a thing where the recognition of the harms that have been done, that there are efforts to make amends, there's still extractions that are happening, but the beautiful thing that has been happening through social media, not necessarily the mainstream media, but through social media, is that people have been able to share their own stories and share their own perspectives and build solidarity, right? So you have Standing Rock, right? That happened again not too long ago. And the great solidarity that was generated around that, like it stopped a pipeline, right? So there's a thing where it's not fast enough. It definitely needs to be accelerated, and part of, like I said, my work is trying to help accelerate that. But I guess my sense is that there is a sense of hopefulness. There is a sense of like cultural reconnection, again, indigenous revitalization that is happening. And partly that is through their own self-advocacy and solidarity. And part of that is through, again, well-meaning and genuinely committed white folks, again, giving up the land. And I say, like, what is people is like, well, what do you mean by decolonizing design? And decolonization is about indigenous rematuration as the land, all the land that was taken from indigenous people, giving it back. And anyone who's not talking about that is not talking about decolonization. The role of design within all that is design. We are the field that makes this values, right, tangible and negotiable and effective, right, in the world, right? Like we design the possibilities of the world, and what values are shaped through that. And what we're doing in decolonizing design and institutions is, I say, we're laying the groundwork for indigenous sovereignty. So to operate, let's say, under the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander values of respect, know, care, and share, to operate under those, like, what does it mean to design a world that is based on those value systems? What does it mean to, again, move away from white supremacy values, right, as a culture, not something that's necessarily embodied in white bodies, right, but
Yeah.
actually as a culture through the work of, like, Tema Okun, and, like, what does it mean to replace those values? Hyper efficiency, which to me, again, is just bad planning, not setting up realistic expectations, right? If the realistic expectation is that it's going to take, 4 months to do this, and you, as a project manager, says we will get it done in 2 without doubling the team, then you are setting up a false sense of urgency and expectations, which will cause a lot of stress. And know how, again, my first job was at Sapient, which was fixed time and fixed price. So I know what it means to drive a project under unrealistic expectations versus realistic expectations. But again, like, replacing those values, right? Like with respect, know, care, and share, for example, or seventh generation thinking, as you're talking about. Like, these are values that I am sure in their full implementation creates a better life for everyone. So the design helps us prepare for what does it feel like to experience respect in all the things that you do. What is it to have institutions that are generally focused on caring, and you feel that, right, in every interaction. This institution cares for me. This institution cares for me. Like, design is the way in which we substantiate that in the world, and decolonizing design is preparing for that eventuality by beginning to design the things that make us feel those values in the world, right?
I feel and I hope that one of the good sides of social media is that um, more and more people are connecting with the humanity of decolonization and the humanity of returning lands that were stolen, that the resources were extracted and used and abused. I feel, I mean, my kids are too young to be activists. They're 4.5 years old. Um, but nevertheless, I feel that the role of those of us who are older is to give the space to young people to be activists, to protect them, to ensure that they don't have to worry about a roof over their head and food, so they can do the things that we feel sometimes that is too risky for us to do because jobs and social and security and all of that. And also give them the space to make mistakes and be like, fine, like that's absolutely fine. You thought that was a good cause. It made sense based on what you knew. And you figured out 6 months later that there are a bunch of things which no one was aware of, and it wasn't what it was, how it was presented, let's say, and you didn't know all the variables. But that's fine, right? Because you did it from a place where you wanted to defend, stand up for people who were marginalized, yeah, to give back to those who others have taken from. And that I find encouraging of social media and youth movements. And I think the harshest example that we have at the moment, the one that personally and many people affects us, our anxiety levels and our sense of humanity, is obviously what's happening to Palestinians, what's happening in Gaza. I think we cannot talk about decolonization without approaching, yeah, talking about that subject. Where we have to say it's the 16th of April. So by the time this gets produced and released, I don't know, you and I don't know what the state of the world is going to be and what the state of that conflict, which the ICJ considers could plausibly be a genocide, what it's going to be. But it seems to be all playing out on a very large scale, all these things that have been covered up, not talked about, and not addressed for the longest of times. But youth gives me hope, and people's advocacy around the world gives me hope as well. Do you share in that hope a little bit?
I do. And again, it's a thing where there is, both in terms of like my own personal ethos, right, around decolonization, and then the same my scholarship around decolonization, as well um, as again that ethos around like who is the most vulnerable, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's a long African American tradition of support for the Palestinian struggle. It is viewed as something that is deeply connected to our own. Um, Again, there are those who have different positions, but I would say that the general position of the kind of liberatory, progressive, self determination wing of the African American political spectrum is in support of Palestine. And it's been, again, what has been heartening in this very disheartening situation is for people who, you know, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, again, held a very, let's say, a misunderstanding of a pro-Jewish position, because I think that's what they were seeing themselves for. Having now a deeper understanding of like the history of Zionism, and then being able to decouple Judaism from Zionism, and then now we're, well, again, come, let's say, October the 20th, there were people who were being blackballed, right, from positions and opportunities because of their support for the Palestinian cause. That now, again, you have students who are taking over buildings and massive protests in the streets and shutting down of bridges and
San Francisco a few
airports.
days ago, I think.
Yeah, and
Yesterday.
so for me, it's been really heartening for people to understand how propaganda works and to not believe it, right? To have access to other channels of information so they see the differences between how things are being reported, and so they're not they're open to other possibilities of what is happening in the world. It is heartening for people to see, I would say, like the end of Pax Americana, right? Where right now the United States has completely lost its position as any kind of moral authority around, um, like democracy or
Mm-hmm.
justice. And again, I'm African American, so my sense of like the American position of these was always doubtful and skeptical by my own, histories and current situations of my peoples. But for others to be able to see that and understand that and shift their understanding and their positioning in relationship to that, for people like right now, yesterday was tax day, and there's a huge movement to withhold 5% of your taxes, which is the percentage of taxes that are devoted to the military.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a big movement to withhold, 5% or more of your tax. Actually, the whole thing is to actually say in the Constitution, if you're opposed to war, that a legitimate war that your country is causing, you have a right to not actually pay taxes, right?
Oh.
So there's some civic education that is happening. There's some understandings of how propaganda work. There are some, again, people whose lives were such that they could ignore. A lot of things are now being forced to pay attention to how the interconnections of injustices in the world, right? And then they are demanding better of their governments, better of their institutions. And that, to me, makes me feel as frightening as this situation is, as I think about the election coming in November, as frightening as this situation is, um, I feel optimistic because I know that enough people have woken up to the ways in which the world is horrendously unjust for a lot of people. And the problem is like our political cycles of voting and things like that are out of sync with what people's feelings and attitudes are, right? Like, so, like this is April, voting doesn't happen to November. And there's a lot of harm that can be done, right, in that period of time.
Up until a month before or whatever it is, where then other new promises come out. Oh, we're sorry, we didn't know better, we did it for you, or whatever reasons that can be valid to say, but still vote for me, right? Or still vote for our party.
The thing that gives me, though, the most hope is that, so again, I was actually last year, 2020, well, last year before last year, so 2022, I got caught in a bit of the fray that was in last year, where I came out very pro-Palestinian as part of my role. Because there was a conflict that was happening. Palestinian students were like, Dori, you say you're about decolonization. Why are you not saying anything? So I said something. And I got, I would say, semi punished for it. Um, and that had made me even more willing to take the risk to support the Palestinian struggle, which has meant that, like one of my Palestinian former students just wrote me last Friday saying, thank you, right, for being steadfast, because you've been steadfast, I feel braver to be who I am and to find the positions that are aligned with who I am as a Palestinian young woman. And I've connected with this Designers Against Oppression organization, and we're doing this work. And I wouldn't have had the courage to do that if you hadn't shown me what it meant to be authentically yourself and in your position in a time when we had a conversation around where, do I hide who I am in order to get by in this world? And I was saying, no. If you have the luxury to do so, because it is a luxury, right? If you have the luxury to do so, then be as authentically and openly authentic to who you are as you can be, so that the people who will embrace and support that can find you. And that is what they did. And so now within all that is happening, they are finding their own pathways of flourishing and activism and contribution. Um, and and I'm so happy that I was in both the position and have a deep sense of integrity to be able to model the possibility of being authentically who you are for these students. It's not just her, but just these students, and to have that reflected back to me. That thank you for that. Right.
Thank you for being a role model and for continuously standing up for those who are marginalized and are being oppressed. What do you think we as human beings, what could we do better or differently to be more kind, more inclusive, more just, or more compassionate?
And this is where I go back to the book, because it's all about how do I design for liberatory joy. So every decision I make, I'm like, how is this going to bring liberation, especially to the most vulnerable? How does this create conditions of joy? And by joy, I just mean connection, right? Because all of these systems of oppression, exploitation, whatever, they're about dividing us so that they can keep us under control. So how do I break down any sense of division so that allows me to connect, and through that connection find joy? So if you orient yourself with this one concept, liberatory joy, but two questions, how is this bringing liberty to the most vulnerable? And how do I create conditions of joy through connection? Then I don't know, like that seems to me like a way to make sure you're headed in the right direction. And the beautiful thing is that if you're in connection, when you're in the wrong direction, people will tell you out of love.
Mm.
And so being able to make mistakes and make amends, maybe that's the third part of it.
Thank you so much. Before our time ends today, and I really appreciate the warm and open conversation that we had, and my wish to explore the way we think as human beings and why we think the way we do from as many perspectives as possible. Is there anyone that comes to your mind who you say, I should really talk to?
Oh, see, this is the thing. I'm like infinitely curious. So I like when I talk to everyone, I'm always bad at these questions. Like, what's the one book or the one thing? And I'm
You can
terrible.
give me a list. I'm fine. I'll contact them all and I'll interview them as soon as I can.
There isn't anyone who comes to mind probably in the way in which you're thinking about it. Like it's normally for me, what are the things that I'm just encountering at the moment?
Which is the right context for me, the moment, and what are the connections that you have, and where's your curiosity being piqued
Yeah.
at the moment?
If you haven't, Dr. Cheryl Miller, who is I say the grand dame of graphic design. One of the, I guess she does a lot of history of Black design. She has a book that's actually coming out next year, but I've been able to see aspects of it. And this would be one person that I would really. I think it's important for people to know. So the book she has coming out next year is here. So we are the Black designers are a life of advocacy. I don't know why I guess have difficulty saying that today. Um, she is a really important person to have a conversation with because she has such a unique lived experience. And she's that generation of designers whose stories haven't been able to really be told. So she's both telling the stories of her generation, but she's also telling her story. And to be able to have a glimpse, like I am quite privileged, if that's the right word, to come late enough in time where there were so fewer restrictions in terms of what I've been able to do, what I've been able to accomplish. But for her not just her resilience, but her like cleverness in terms of like where you have all of these systems of oppression in place, all of these discriminatory practices, like finding the way through them, and to order to be able to have such an extraordinarily successful career. I think again that may be a book of the moment, because as things particularly clamp down here in the United States, but sometimes where the United States goes, others follow. So being able to have an understanding of how one can navigate those systems, and again, as that's as a sort of indigenous Black POC person, right? But also, again, if you're thinking about like from the perspective of a white male who's in manager positions or whatever, understanding what are the barriers that she faced that even may have been looser now than they are back then, to have an understanding of how those operated, and then to have that consciousness to make sure those systems don't get reproduced in what is happening today, is such a valuable perspective to bring, right, to the work that you do.
Thank you. I hope that I'll have a chance to talk to her, to have a conversation with her. I thank you, yeah, very much for your time today. I
Yeah.
hope we'll have another opportunity to talk again. I unfortunately didn't get to meet you this time on your book tour.
No worries. I'll be back. I'll be back. I after coming from Scotland, I'm getting a lot more invitations to come back to Europe. So I think I'll be back in Europe.
uh, we'll be in touch, and I will. Yeah, I would really like to meet you in person and to sit down and have a coffee together. So let's keep in touch. Thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure to have you as my guest today. Where can my viewers and listeners find out more about what you're doing, what's coming up, and how they can either reach out to you or connect with you to learn more themselves about decolonization?
So where you find me is on Instagram at Dori_Tunstall, LinkedIn. I think Dori Tunstall just on LinkedIn as well. What I have coming up is that I'm teaching a course with CalArts Extended Studies. So there are 3 courses actually. One on whiteness without white supremacy. So they're online, asynchronous, but it's a good place to build community. So it's creative explorations of whiteness without white supremacy that begins May 22nd. And I love this. I've done this as a workshop before, but it's in relationship to things that we talked to, like, again, how do you as white folks begin to do the work? So part of that is like a generative creative process of understanding how white supremacy as a culture works and how one begins to generate an identity of whiteness and Europeanness that is okay, it's fine, but without the white supremacy that comes with it. So how do you choose other values by which you want to live your life? The second course is hiring for decolonization and cultural justice in creative industries. So that kicks off on June the 4th. And that's really looking at, like, how do you have the cultural competency to be able to, as we described, create that diverse board or to create that diverse team. And what are the steps you have to take in order to be able to prepare both the institution and the individuals that you're trying to embrace, right, to come into your organization. And the last course is Business Transformation for Cultural Appreciation, Not Appropriation, which begins on July the 10th. And this is looking conceptual, practical, and self-evaluative frameworks to understand what's the relationship between colonization and cultural appropriation. And then how does one have to transform one's business practices to be able to embrace cultural communities with appreciation and respect. And so again, all those companies that keep getting in trouble for cultural appropriation, it's your business structure that's the problem. So how do we begin to work through your business structure and assumptions and pay scales and all these things that become a barrier for you really to be able to embrace in a respectful way the diversities and innovation that comes from embracing cultural communities in a respectful way.
Well, I invite all leaders and organizations out there, yeah, to definitely sign up for your courses, um, to challenge themselves, to be uncomfortable, but in a safe environment with someone like yourself who's been doing this for many, many years and who knows how to accompany organizations and people in a very professional and respectful way along the journey. The more of us who do join, yeah, the more change we're going to bring and the more just and fair world that we'll build in the future. So I'm going to link to all of those in the description below. And I hope many, many people will sign up. Thank you again and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you.